the lecture for chapter 26. This week we'll be talking about the triumph of conservatism. So there's this turn towards a conservative lens on the nation following that year 1968 where we left off last time. So there was this decade full of tumult, and then we end up with this backlash of conservatism. So Nixon's sort of the epitome of this for a lot of people at the beginning. With the end of World War II, conservatism had been sort of conflated with conspiracy theorists, anti-Semites, social hierarchy over things like democracy and equality. It was associated with racism and misogyny and those sorts of things. And following World War II, and especially into the 1960s, people started to see those sorts of behaviors and opinions as more relics from the past and something to be left behind. The anti-war and civil rights movements pushed some who would have been in the center closer to the right. It encouraged some to move further left, but it did also encourage some to move further right. And Nixon used this political center as it shifted towards the right to his benefit. Nixon's sort of this weird mixed bag. He was essentially pandering to those who believed in the division of federal and states' rights to the point where they believed that states' rights should supersede federal rights. And part of what he did there was giving block grants for states to use rather than saying what they should be used for. But at the same time, he created overarching umbrella agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency, OSHA, and the NTSB. And that's the National Transportation Safety Board. Those are all still in current use and have largely been seen to be beneficial to the nation. Nixon was also involved in creating a family assistance plan, and this would have led the government to guarantee a minimum income in order to counteract poverty. This ended up not going all the way through, but he was part of attempting to expand social programs within the federal government, while at the same time trying to make nice with people who wanted to do things at the state level, and also cashing in on this newfound wave of conservatism. Integration was still on the rise based on the laws of the past 2 decades, but Nixon still ended up trying to be a friend to groups that were largely seen as racist. Affirmative action was an attempt at ensuring minority employment, and the one example of this was the Philadelphia Plan, which required projects receiving federal funds to hire a certain percentage of minority workers. And Nixon thought that this movement would help to weaken the unions because he thought it would sow discontent among the people. And in May of 1970, construction workers in New York City actually marched and assaulted anti-war protesters as a result of the building steam from these sorts of actions. In response, that Philadelphia plan was abandoned in favor of a voluntary plan. So the idea behind the voluntary plan is that people would be able to choose for themselves how many people of these different non-white races would be able to be hired onto these jobs. So you can imagine many did not expand very far into this, and that attempt at affirmative action basically failed. Busing was another one of these attempts at attempting to fully integrate the school system. There were many white families that had moved into the suburbs in order to escape what they saw as the chaos of the inner cities at this point. With the race riots that had taken place during the 1960s, many people felt that cities were then unsafe and wanted to escape the potential for those actions to take place again. And a lot of this has been come to be known as what's called white flight. And partially it was due to concerns over these race riots, partially it was the expansion of the suburbs, and partially it was a way to avoid integration. Busing came to be because it was policy that people were using to integrate the school systems forcibly, where neighborhoods were segregated due to race. And neighborhoods were still segregated based on race because of the policies of the federal government and the real estate policies and the banking policies that had come before that we talked about. So if you've redlined all of these neighborhoods, decided who can live where based on their racial characteristics, that means that if they're going to attend a neighborhood school, it's mostly going to be people of the same race going to the same school. Boston had a particularly poor reaction to the busing program. They're not the only ones. This did not go well in most places, but Boston in particular met up with, as did many places, but met up with this attempt at integrating poor whites and poor blacks. So they did not manage to catch much of the middle class of any group or the upper class of any group. They were essentially integrating poor kids, and many times this led to physical attacks on students in both scenarios, because it was both African American kids being bused into Caucasian American schools and Caucasian American kids being bused into African American schools. And many who did not fall in the poor socioeconomic status, those who were wealthy, for example, attended private schools. And there were some whites who started to refer to affirmative action as reverse discrimination. They felt that they were being discriminated against for being white and not getting extra points, as they saw it, to be admitted or hired into something. And of course, this is overlooking the fact that one group was going into this with systemic racial caveats put up against them by the laws that had existed for hundreds of years in the country. There continued to be this sexual revolution that had started in the 60s and continued to move forward. And this sexual revolution started to evolve a little bit as the 70s progressed. Divorces rose up double from 10 years before, and the age of marriage also rose up, and people were having less children in those later marriages. Part of the reason for this is that women were becoming independent and they had the ability to seek out higher education and career opportunities. Those realms were expanding for many women. Many colleges and universities started to allow women to attend when they hadn't before. And partly this is in conjunction with the 1972 Title IX. And this was put into place in order to ban gender discrimination in higher education. And this had a dramatic impact on many institutions. For example, the school that I pursued my PhD at Lehigh University, they started really accepting women into their engineering programs in the 70s. So this is not that long ago, realistically. This is about 50 years ago. And this has a dramatic impact on the jobs that women would be able to, that they would be able to pursue in the employment field. So Nixon believed that cooperation could potentially replace hostility. He preferred international stability over this continued fighting, as in Vietnam and different proxy wars against the Soviet Union. And this made him seem sort of soft to a lot of people on foreign policy. And he thought that if the US and the Soviet Union were stable, then North Vietnam might be convinced to stop their onslaught, that they wouldn't want to take over the entirety of both North and South Vietnam. And Nixon actually went to the Soviet Union in order to talk about freezing nuclear arsenals, and there was also an anti-ballistic missile treaty that banned the development of machines that could intercept incoming missiles. And the reason that they wanted to ban machines that could do away with an incoming missile is that the idea of MAD, or mutually assured destruction, would remain intact at that point. So each country would still have this giant fear of launching an attack on the other one because they wouldn't be able to stop their incoming missiles. And we talked a little bit about this last week. As in the 1960s, the American Indian movement continued to launch major protests. The AIM moved to reoccupy Wounded Knee, where we've talked about this before, but at the end of the 19th century, there had been a large-scale massacre of the Lakota people by U.S. Armed Forces at Wounded Knee. And so this was a symbolic reoccupation of the land where this horrible massacre had happened, and where many people believed that there had been some sort of spiritual death for Native Americans as well. And this was, in fact, an armed reoccupation in 1973, and there were 200 Oglala Lakota who, from February to May, were there as a protest. And again, they were armed. And there was also, specifically in the moment, a protest against the murder of a Native American man by a white man who received only second-degree manslaughter rather than a murder charge. So there was an instigating factor that was direct, but it was also in response to a long history of broken treaties between the United States government and Native American governments. U.S. troops ended up firing on the Native American men in the same location as they had decades before, and 2 Sioux men were killed by federal agents. And on May 8th, the American Indian movement and their followers ended up having to surrender, and some escaped in order to avoid punishment, and others were arrested. There's a documentary that you're going to be watching that's posted with your assignment for your final short paper, and you will watch another documentary about the reoccupation of Alcatraz as well, which we talked about last week. So the Vietnam War continued, and it continued several years into the 1970s. And Vietnam seemed to a lot of people to really just be dragging on at this point. And it involved a lot more people than current wars that the United States is involved in. And there was this new tactic that they were trying out, and it's called Vietnamization. So, Vietnamization. And the idea is that they would replace American troops with South Vietnamese troops. And this was an attempt to remove US soldiers from the combat role in the war and bring them home and take out that element of the US participation. The US ended up invading Cambodia in order to cut off supply lines for the NVA, the North Vietnamese Army. And this move ended up destabilizing Cambodia and actually led to the rise of the Khmer Rouge. And that group, the Khmer Rouge, ended up turning into a genocidal regime. So the US had unintended consequences for their invasion in Cambodia as well. And in 1970, the infamous Kent State killings happened. There were campuses across the nation that erupted in protest following this, when there had been anti-war protests, and 4 people were killed by the Ohio National Guard while protesting the war. And this led to more protests across the nation at different universities, because if they were killing students who were involved in protests at their college campus, what was next? Vietnam vets ended up becoming heavily involved in protesting against the war when they returned home. So people who had been fighting abroad ended up saying that the United States should not be involved and that warfare should not continue. Of course, that's not all of the people who returned, but there were many soldiers who returned in this state, and there were many who also deserted the armed forces while they were abroad, as sort of a protest against what the United States government was having them do. And in 1969, the My Lai massacre was publicized. It had happened 1 year before, and we mentioned this last week, that there was only one soldier who was found guilty and sent to jail, and he was released a few years later. So there were a lot of people who were becoming increasingly concerned about the American role in the Vietnam-American War. And there's this book called Patriots. It's the Vietnam War Remembered from All Sides by Christian Appy. And he wrote this book in order to talk about all the different viewpoints from the war. And there are stories from varied sources, like American soldiers, Vietnamese soldiers on both the northern and southern sides, civilians on both sides, protesters on both sides, and those who provided all of the work that surrounds what these people who were involved on the front lines were doing. And there are so many stories in this book. I honestly can't suggest enough that you get this book if you're interested in warfare, or in people's stories, or in anti-warfare, or really just seeing how interconnected all people are, even in that sort of situation. It's one of the better compiled books, and there are short chapters about historical context, and the stories are sort of grouped together, but I suggest you get it, but I am going to read a few different stories for you so that you can hear them. It'll be like I'm an audiobook, basically, for 5 different stories. There are many, many different stories in this book, though. Some of them are very short, some of them are a little bit longer, but it's meant to give you a large number of people's perspectives. So we'll start with, we'll actually start with the second one in the list here. And it says, along with tens of thousands of North Vietnamese girls, she volunteered to work on the Trong Song, the dozens of footpaths and roads known to Americans as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Volunteer Youth Corps was formed in 1965 as part of the massive effort to expand and improve the transportation network. These teenage boys and girls cut down trees, cleared and leveled trails, filled in bomb craters, and defused unexploded bombs. Discussing that experience with 5 women veterans of the Youth Volunteer Corps, one thought the minimum age to volunteer was 16, another 17, and another 18. Then one said, if you insisted, they would let you go whatever your age. Vu Thi Vinh, I believe is how you say her name, lied about her age and volunteered to work on the trails at age 15 despite her parents' opposition. We were so young we didn't know anything, but our patriotism was very high. We went to war willingly. And what she says is, at first there were no trails, just mountains. Cutting the roads was a superhuman task. Our only tools were picks, shovels, and saws. When trees were too big to cut down by hand, we blew them down with dynamite. It took at least 20 people to roll the big trees aside. We also had to dam up streams with rocks to keep them from swamping the trails. Sometimes we had to stand forever and water up to our chests. During the rainy season, it was almost impossible to get dry. Most of the time, we worked only at night because that's when the trucks and soldiers came, and we needed to be ready to help if they got stuck. Usually, we slept from about 7:30 to 11 in the morning. When we had lunch and took classes and continued our education afterwards. After that, we slept again until 4:30. Supper was at 5 o'clock, and then we were off to work again. Of course, in emergency situations, we worked day and night. If the trail was blocked for just 1 hour, there'd be a terrible traffic jam, and that was an invitation to American bombers. Anytime bombs hit the trails, we had to rush out and fill the craters immediately. After one bombing strike, we discovered a big bomb lying unexploded in a small stream next to a bridge. There was a danger that a truck passing over the bridge might set it off, so our leader selected a Dare to Die team to defuse the bomb. Everyone wanted to be on the team, so we had to write a short essay to apply. The only safe way to defuse a bomb was to explode it, even though that meant destroying part of the bridge we'd built. But we managed to explode the bomb and repair the bridge before the trucks came that night. Needless to say, life in the jungle was extremely hard. When we weren't supplied with rice, we ate whatever we could find. We searched for crabs under the rocks and streams, and occasionally we were lucky enough to come up with some cassava. Sometimes we had to scrape fungus and moss off rocks. Aircraft vegetables, we called them, because they were the only edible things left after all the bombing. We were so hungry, everything tasted good. The mountains were filled with red ginseng trees. We'd boil the leaves and stems and then throw them away and drink the broth. It was very sweet and nutritious. The Trong Song jungle gave us life. After exhausting labor, we'd go back to our camps and sing songs or perform plays. We sang all the time to keep our spirits up. We used to joke that you couldn't hear the bombs over our singing. So that's something that a lot of people may not have really thought about before, how people kept the trails clean, or you may have assumed that soldiers on either side was in charge of that sort of thing. And as with many wars throughout world history, there have been people who were underage, and there have also been women who are involved. And I have another story for you here. Helen Tennant Hagelheimer. She was a flight attendant for World Airways, And she was contracted, the airway was contracted to ferry U.S. troops in and out of the war zone. And she talks about what it was like to be in this situation. So she was a flight attendant for people who were going in and out of the war. She says, when I was a young gal, I watched the Mickey Mouse Club and did a program on what it was like to be a stewardess. I absolutely glued to the TV after that. I cannot remember a time I did not want to be a stewardess. We had extremely strict rules about our appearance. Everybody had to look exactly the same. We even had to wear the same fingernail polish and the same kind of perfume. You weren't allowed to wear earrings, and our hair had to be short or at least worn up. You could not look provocative in our uniforms. They were very tailored, sort of Jackie Kennedy-like camel hair suits. The skirts were mid-knee, even though it was the 60s. And the most distinctive thing was our polo hat that had this huge crown on it. Of course, there was a lot of sexism in those days, but I don't remember any of the guys on the Vietnam flights ever giving me a bad time. They were very respectful. Our real job was to distract them at all costs to get their mind away from where they were going. If that meant flirting with them a little bit, so what? It never did go over the line. But the captain could get away with just about anything. For instance, we were required to wear girdles, so if the captain came up behind me and slapped me on the butt, he'd say, "Girdle check." Most of the pilots were World War II or Korean War veterans. I thought they were ancient and didn't want anything to do with them. Going over, there were usually two legs. Travis Air Force Base to Japan and Japan to Vietnam. From California to Japan, the troops did a lot of letter writing. Guys would ask me, is this a good letter? If you received this, would you wait for me? At first, I read the letters, but they really pulled at your heart. So after a while, I would just pretend to read them and say they were perfect. There were always some chatty guys who wanted to talk, and if we had any special unit guys, Green Berets or Airborne Rangers, there was a lot of bravado. They spoke proudly of their training, how difficult it was for them not to get washed out. Over time, I realized they weren't really trying to impress me as much as they were trying to convince themselves that their training would help them. These were boys destined for combat, and they had been told in training what their expected mortality rate was. I remember an Air Force Blue Beret actually told me that they were trained to die. He didn't expect to ever go home. But most of the guys were really pretty quiet. They asked us for alcohol, and we said if the military wanted you to have that, they would have put it in the contract. Since the war, I've had a lot of vets tell me that they were served alcohol, but I don't think so. Maybe this policy changed later in the war, but sometimes people's memories do strange things. When we got to Yokota Air Force Base in Japan, we had a crew change. So after a layover, I'd get on another plane with a group of guys I hadn't met who had already been on the plane for 12 hours. We had to kind of feel out the mood. By then, they were usually very quiet. It was 5 hours to Vietnam and 5 hours back. We called this the Vietnam turnaround. We go in and out with minimal ground time. Sometimes we had F-4 Phantoms escort us in. All of a sudden, they'd just appear right on our wingtips and come all the way down with us. It was an absolutely gorgeous sight. We'd touch down and they'd pull up, but they didn't escort us every time, so you wondered what was going on down there to make them appear. The guys would always ask, and we'd always just tell them that the F-4 pilots wanted to show off. I especially remember when we came in at night. That's when you saw the tracer rounds, chemically treated to emit a bright color when fired. I was so naive I didn't realize tracers were live rounds. I don't know what I thought I was seeing. Maybe target practice or fireworks. Who knows? Only years later did some veteran tell me I'd been witnessing actual firefights, that the red tracers were ours and the green tracers were theirs. I said, Who in this world sits down and says, you're going to have this color and you're going to have that color? Sometimes the senior stew would come around and ask for another pair of eyes and ears in the cockpit. I did that several times. There's a jump seat right behind the captain with earphones. On my first flights into Tan Son Nhut, the tower was still run by Vietnamese, and the pilot couldn't always understand their English. I'll never forget the captain turning around and saying, "Did anybody understand what that guy just said?" And we were on our final approach. One time I was sitting in the jump seat when an ammo depot blew up right in front of us. The guys on the ground thought it was us that blew it up. It was the senior stew's position to be at the top of the ramp when the men got off in Vietnam. But when we were about 2 hours out, she would usually ask for a volunteer to take the forward door. All you had to do is stand at the door and say goodbye. But nobody wanted that job. It's nothing disparaging about the other gals, but many just couldn't do it. I'd always take the forward door, and I was good at it. I never said goodbye or good luck. I would shake their hand, look them in the eye, smile, and say, "See you later." Sometimes I'd say, "See you in 12 months." They really wanted somebody to look at them. At the top of the ramp was the world. At the bottom of the ramp was the war. I saw eyes full of fear, some with real terror. And maybe this sounds crazy, but I saw death in some of those eyes. At that moment, at the top of the ramp, I was their wife, their sister, their girlfriend, and for those troops who had no one else, and there were many, I was their mother. That was the most important thing I've ever done. I can't imagine doing anything more important than to nudge a troop into war. If he wasn't lucky, I was nudging him to his death with the best "it will be okay" smile I could conjure up. I don't think that there was one of us who did not want to keep them on the plane. That's why some of the girls were back in the bathrooms crying. They couldn't stand to watch them leave. They were very aware we were sending them to war and that some of them would never come back. Therein lies the guilt. I spent a lot of time wondering if instead of distracting them, I should have warned them. I've been assured by veterans that there was nothing I could have said. I mean, imagine some stewardess saying, "Hey, you guys, listen, this is really going to be rough." For a long time, I felt guilty, but I still think it's the best thing that I've ever done, the most unselfish. I just thought that they deserved to have someone from home stand there and be as strong as they were. We never showed any emotion in front of the troops, but we sure drank a lot when we got back to Japan. We substituted booze for crying. There were an awful lot of guys who said, "I don't have anybody to write to. Will you write to me?" You could pretty much tell whether they were pulling your leg or not, so my roommate and I wrote to a lot of them. We'd also go to the liquor store when the new issue of Playboy arrived and buy up the entire supply. Then we'd have this mass mailing night sending Playboy magazines to these guys in Vietnam. The first thing we'd ask when we arrived in Vietnam is, are we taking troops out? If you took 165 men in and 165 out, you could really fool yourself into believing that they were all going home. But in 1966 and 1967, the war was escalating, so we often left Vietnam with an empty plane. There was nothing else to say other than, they're not all coming home. It would just slam you right in the face. You did not want to be on that airplane if we flew back empty. There were 5 stewardesses, and we didn't even sit with each other. And when we got back to Japan, we drank even heavier. I've heard stories about guys cheering when the plane took off from Vietnam, but I don't remember any cheering. When the plane lifted off, I could see right down the aisle from a seat in the back. There may have been 1 or 2 hands that reached across the aisle to shake hands, but it was pretty quiet. Pretty soon the captain came on and said, "Gentlemen, we've just cleared Vietnam airspace." Her voice catches. It still gets to me. So then it was as if everyone on the plane exhaled, but they still didn't cheer. On the way back, we walked down the aisle, looking to see which ones might want to talk and which ones you ought to leave alone. You just started by asking, where are you from? But we never asked anything about what they did in Vietnam, and I don't remember anybody ever saying anything to me about it. I clearly remember thinking these guys are not going home to their girlfriend in that 55 Chevy that they've been working on. Their youth was gone, and it showed. You absolutely saw a different look in their eyes on the way home. There were guys who came up to me and said, I need to talk because I want to practice. I'm afraid I'm going to swear in front of my mother when I get home. So they'd talk, and every other word was a swear. I wouldn't flinch. I'd just say, don't worry, you'll be okay. No, they said. I can just see me sitting down to dinner, and the first word out of my mouth is fucking this or goddamn that. These boys grew up the same way that I did in the 50s. We attended church. We understood right from wrong. I believe they did things in Vietnam that were totally against everything they were brought up with. And I'm not really talking about the killing. I'm thinking about those other things that happened to young men in war. Drinking, maybe drugs, and contact with girls. So they weren't just afraid of swearing in front of their mothers. They were afraid their mothers would be able to tell everything that they had done in Vietnam. I think this was a big reason why so many veterans just shut down and wouldn't talk about the war to anyone except someone who had been there. And they came home to a world that was very different, even just 12 months later. Flying in, some guys asked, how bad are the anti-war demonstrations? That's the hardest question I've ever had to answer in my life. I'd say they're bad. There were often protesters at the gates outside Travis Air Force Base. I had to tell these boys that they had just served their country to get out of their country's uniform as soon as they could. If they weren't wearing their uniform, then maybe they wouldn't be targeted by the protesters. I didn't like the anti-war movement then, and I haven't changed my mind today. It just seemed like the protest movement targeted the soldiers more than they did the policymakers, making it seem as if all the soldiers had gotten together one afternoon in a bar and decided to go commit some sort of crime against the people of Vietnam. They came home so quickly, and they had no time to adjust. Some men had just gotten out of combat a few hours before they got on the plane. Before a meal service, we'd make sure everyone was awake. We always had to be very careful about waking these guys up. If you touched them, they would wake up defending themselves, arms flying all over the place. We managed to hold them down until they realized where they were. It only took a second, and we always smiled. They always apologized. Oh, ma'am, I'm sorry. I didn't hurt you, did I? We tried not to make a big deal about it. Every time we arrived at Travis Air Force Base, I was disappointed. I had grown up with World War II movies, and everybody had a band or something to welcome them home. At Travis, there was absolutely nothing. It was just me at the bottom of the ramp. An ungrateful nation let some 23-year-old stewardess welcome these guys home. That was their only greeting. In the 90s, this woman started going to Washington, D.C. for Veterans Day. A highlight of the trip is the DMZ to Delta Dance, sponsored by a chapter of Vietnam veterans in America. It's a bunch of old people dancing to great rock and roll. The theme song of the dance, of course, is We Gotta Get Out of This Place. It's always the last song of the evening. And I will post these other three for you so that you can read them at your leisure. But I really do suggest getting this book if you're at all interested in this, because these are particularly detailed stories from people who were thinking about what it meant to be a part of this, and many different ways of being a part of this. What starts to really dig in for much of the middle of the country is the Pentagon Papers. And these papers were a grouping of documents that essentially showed that the leaders of the United States were quite sure that the Vietnam War would be unwinnable and that they continued the war regardless. And they also detailed some of the secret actions that the United States had taken throughout the war. And they were released to the New York Times and were going to be publicized when Nixon decided that he wanted to suppress them. And the Washington Post joined in, and they thought that people should be able to read them and publish them. Eventually, the Supreme Court stepped in to make sure that it was clear that the papers would be published and that suppressing them was unconstitutional. And it was a violation of the freedom of speech and the freedom of the press. In 1973, there was a negotiated settlement called the Paris Peace Agreement, and this meant the withdrawal of American troops from Vietnam. In 1975, North Vietnam pushed into the South, and the so-called Fall of Saigon, which was the capital of South Vietnam, shocked the American nation. Saigon is now named Ho Chi Minh City after the leader of the North Vietnamese army. And the United States did not intervene at this point except for to remove their people from the American embassy in the South. This is seen as the only war up until that point that the U.S. had lost. The War of 1812 was essentially a truce, and the Korean War, while many people would consider that a loss by the Americans, it's seen as a truce as well. 58,000 American soldiers were killed during the Vietnam War, and 3 to 4 million Vietnamese people were killed throughout the war as well. In the years to come, many officials would express the sentiment that they knew that it was wrong and that they felt that their involvement in the war was wrong and that they regretted it. And not only because of the Vietnam War, but for his general personality and the general way that he conducted his political life, Nixon had a list of enemies that was essentially a mile long. He was called Tricky Dick, and this helped him accrue these enemies over time. Eventually, he had 5 workers from his re-election campaign break into the Watergate apartment complex in order to search the Democratic National Headquarters. And the security guard ended up calling the police. The White House's involvement wasn't immediately clear in the Watergate scandal, but became so as the so-called Nixon tapes became a known source. And the Supreme Court demanded access to these tapes following Nixon's firing of the special prosecutor and the attorney general, and his deputy had resigned in protest of that firing in what is called the Saturday Night Massacre. So there was a lot of firing of different officials within the administration, and there was audio proof that Nixon had essentially ordered this spy mission. A 1974 House Judiciary Committee recommended that Nixon be impeached for obstruction of justice. As a reminder, the House impeaches people, but the Senate removes people from office. So Nixon is the only president in history to resign when it became clear that he'd be removed from office should he not resign. The vice president, Spiro Agnew, who had run with Nixon, had actually resigned in 1973 before that, following evidence that he had been involved in accepting bribes when he was governor of Maryland. So Gerald Ford, who had been appointed as vice president after Agnew's resignation, Gerald Ford became president when Nixon resigned. Ford and his VP, Nelson Rockefeller, were the only pair to be put in the highest office without either one ever having been voted into public office. There was a sharp economic decline in the 1970s for many different reasons, but part of it has to do with the continuing Cold War, part of it has to do with the continuing Vietnam War, and some of it has to do with a decline in manufacturing. And this, in 1971, the U.S. Saw more goods being imported than there were being exported. So they were not making enough to sustain the U.S. population. The dollar was separated from the gold standard at this point, meaning that currencies would float in relationship to one another, and their worth would be determined not by treaty, but by international currency markets. So being off the gold standard means that there's nothing physically to back that up. And this word started to become popular at this point, and that's stagflation. So this is a stagnant economy with growing inflation. And this is not a good situation, as you might imagine. If people's wages weren't going up, this would mean that any sort of inflation on the prices would be felt that much harder on everybody. And the so-called oil shock ended up coming in 1973 when there was a war between Israel, Egypt, and Syria. And the U.S. was in support of Israel, which drew a lot of criticism from Middle Eastern nations, which then in turn withdrew their oil from U.S. markets. And this led to lines and lines of cars at gas stations, rationing of oil, and running out of gas entirely at many stations. So many people who were alive during this time really remember this severe lack in a resource that many people see as a daily basic resource. There had been previous agreements between workers and employers that had held strong through the Golden Age. We talked about sort of this pause on mass labor movements and this truce, and trying to come up with a way that would work for both the employer and the employee. And this ended as corporations turned on employees in order to save money and turned towards automation of jobs in order to be rid of people, because people are oftentimes the most expensive part of running a business. And deindustrialization was a big, huge part of this, and the effects of that are still being felt today. But half of the manufacturing jobs were gone that had existed at the end of World War II. So this is a relatively short period of time for this entire manufacturing effort to sort of crumble. The Sun Belt was where many of the manufacturing jobs remain, and this is in the South, and this gave conservatives sort of this leg up with this business concentration. The Twin Towers went up and ended up serving as a symbol of the shift from making things towards finance and business. So this meant that the new business in America was business instead of manufacturing. Ford, as president, chose Nelson Rockefeller as his VP, and as mentioned before, neither one of them were voted in. Because when a vice president resigns, like Spiro Agnew did, or if a vice president dies in office, the president can then choose somebody else to replace them. So typically people know that if the president dies, the vice president becomes president. But if the vice president dies, the president chooses with no election and no say from Congress or anything, that they choose their own vice president. And Ford ended up choosing to pardon Nixon for his obstruction, which was really an unpopular move, but said he wanted to move on from that chapter and move forward instead of focusing on the past. In 1974 into 1975, there was a recession, and this led to 9% unemployment. That's relatively high, especially based on what had been the experience of people in the United States following World War II overall. And the Helsinki Accords were put into place in 1975 when the signing nations recognized the permanence of the World War II boundaries, including East and West Germany. So this was a solidification of East and West Germany and a solidification of the boundaries between the Soviet Union and Europe. In 1976, Ford lost the election, and Jimmy Carter won instead. Jimmy Carter had previously been the governor of Georgia. He was a U.S. Naval Academy graduate, and he had also famously been a peanut farmer. And you can see one of the buttons for Carter for president has a peanut on it. He ran as sort of this outsider who would shake things up, and he's also the first born-again Christian to run for president. And despite how this might sound in today's world, he was relatively progressive in his platform. With regard to race relations, Carter appointed unprecedented numbers of African Americans to important government positions, and he continued to make diversity a major focus, understanding that the nation would not survive if it was not able to effectively integrate its citizens with each other. New Democrats were said to be more concerned about social aspects of the nation than traditional economic matters. And there were many avenues somebody could take in order to stitch up the economy. And some of that was cutting spending on domestic programs. Some other ideas were deregulation in trucking and airline industries to try to drive prices down. There was usury deregulation, which is banking. The interest on a loan company or a credit card company being able to charge. So dealing with the limits for that. And expanding the nuclear energy sector in order to avoid reliance on foreign oil. So there was this focus on trying to find different means of producing energy other than depending on the Middle Eastern nations. 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania saw 1979 malfunction with a large amount of radioactive steam being let out into the air. The environmental and health hazards were of huge concern to people, and the proliferation of nuclear energy and the industry itself ended up slowing down at that point. And this is before Chernobyl happened. And Carter believed that self-indulgence and consumption were sort of on the American people to solve, and that people needed to take some personal responsibility to deal with these things. Human rights were also a huge central concern for Jimmy Carter, and weirdly, he was ridiculed for this a lot of the time. He was concerned that American allies and American forces were involved in human rights abuses across the globe, and that it wasn't just communist countries, as had been the story for many, many years. What he wanted to focus on was the prevention of nuclear weapons, combating poverty, and promoting human rights. And part of this was to give an unconditional pardon to draft evaders from the Vietnam era, meaning they could come home if they had left the country, and if they were in jail for evading the draft, they would be released. The Camp David Accords of 1979 brought Egypt and Israel together for a peace agreement. And in 1978, Carter announced his plan to return control of the Panama Canal to Panama by the year 2000. So we talked about the Panama Canal Zone belonging to the United States and being under U.S. control, but this action meant that it would return control of that area to Panama. In 1977, Jimmy Carter went to Iran to celebrate the controversial Shah's rule. He was a controversial figure because there were many reported human rights abuses across Iran, and the people of Iran turned on the U.S. at this point for participating in the celebration for this Shah. In 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini revolted, essentially, and deposed the Shah, declaring Iran an Islamic republic. In 1979, Carter allowed the Shah to come to the U.S. to seek medical treatment, and in response to this, Khomeini and his followers sent troops to the American embassy and took 66 hostages. They were held from November 1979 to January 1981. And this is what's now commonly known as the Iran hostage crisis. And they were released as soon as Reagan became president, but due to Carter's work on getting them released, not Reagan's work. He was just sworn into office, so he couldn't have done any work. But it does not mean that he didn't claim it as his own victory. And the Soviet Union sent troops into Afghanistan in order to put down a rebellion there, and it turned into what's comparable to the Soviet Union's version of Vietnam with the United States. Money was funneled from the United States into Afghanistan in order to fight the Soviet Union, and out of this came the Taliban into power. So back at home, there was, again, rising conservatism, and there were a lot of economic problems that seemed to really drag on throughout the 1970s, and this led a lot of people to look for lower taxes, deregulation in industry, and cuts in social spending in an attempt to balance out the economy. Civil rights and the sexual revolution had led many people who were in the center or center-right further to the right than they had been, and a rise in criminal activity led people to seek law and order. So this sort of lockdown of the nation, and neoconservatives were sprouting up, suggesting that the 1960s had led to a decline in morals and a decline in respect for authority. They wanted to keep a focus on the Cold War and prove that social programs were actually harmful to those who had been benefiting from them. The Heritage Foundation and the American Enterprise Institute arose from this movement as well, this neoconservative movement. Part of this is also to do with their religious right, so they're called now. So evangelical Protestantism began to really flourish during this time. It already existed, but it really expanded and became a lot more mainstream at this point. And it's sometimes now referred to as the Third Great Awakening, with Carter being the first born-again leader. But the difference between Carter and most of the religious right is that Carter was on the liberal end of things. He was more towards the left than the religious right was. One criticism that came up within the ranks of the religious right was this reliance on new and modern means of communication in order to send old messages out. So we talked before about radio priests having that same sort of concern, and that came up again with television. And there was this thought going around that there was such thing as a moral majority, which was essentially at war against sin, part of the pro-life movement, the pro-family and pro-America in their views. And they were electing candidates that reflected those beliefs. The ERA had originally been promoted in 1920 by Alice Paul, which we talked about previously, and the National Women's Party. And it was being revived by second wave feminists. And in 1972, Congress approved and sent to the states for ratification this Equal Rights Amendment. And there were many protests over this from both men and women, including concerns that the ERA would discredit the role of women as mothers and homemakers. Some thought that this would let men off the hook for their responsibilities in providing for their wives and children as well. And it was left short and still has not been entirely ratified. There was another state that signed on that would have tipped that over, but it has to be, the process has to be renewed at this point. And abortion was a continuing concern. We talked about in Roe versus Wade. Most people are aware of this, but the controversy leads back much longer than that for many people. But there had been many women who had sought what ended up being unsafe medical treatment to seek an abortion. And in 1973, Roe versus Wade allowed for abortion, and this was dictated by the Supreme Court of the United States. The religious right was concerned about this legalization of abortion because they believed that life started at conception and that abortion was equivalent to murder. And feminists, part of the second wave feminist movement, were overjoyed with the prospect of being able to choose for themselves whether or not they would have a completed pregnancy, and that they would have safe and legal access to a medical procedure for their health care. And over Ford's veto, there was a 1976 end to federal abortion funds via Medicaid. And in the 1990s, there were fringe groups that began bombing clinics and murdering doctors in response to abortion. And this case remains in danger of being overturned, and it remains controversial today. People still talk about this at great length, and it's unclear how things will move forward as the Supreme Court of the United States continues to be stacked in favor of more conservative judges. Conservatism in the West was similar as it was in other places, but there had been a lot of evangelical Christians who had moved to the West sort of in droves as the California Republican Party spoke to their set of moral concerns. And Proposition 13 passed in 1978, which banned an increase in property taxes, which benefited homeowners and mostly businesses, and took money out of the coffers for things like public schools and libraries, in addition to other publicly funded items. And so it's sort of this turn towards individualism rather than concern about the greater good. And Ronald Reagan ended up being the guy that many of them were looking for as a leader. He really fired up those who voted for him by saying things like, "Let's make America great again." Yeah, no, Trump did not make that up. And saying things like, "The era of self-doubt is over." And he was speaking seemingly directly to those people who were part of what ends up being this white backlash group. And many of them were fighting back against the leniency of the 1960s, so it had some lasting effects. The campaign kicked off in Philadelphia, Mississippi, where 4 civil rights workers had been previously killed. We talked about them a week or two ago. And the speech that he gave there talked about how states' rights were important. And this led many people to interpret this as the federal government saying that they should have no matters or no concern in things like civil rights. He famously condemned things like welfare cheats, as he called them, busing programs, affirmative action, the ERA, and what he called moral permissiveness, so meaning non-biblical moral structures. And many on the right were willing to overlook the fact that he was not personally religious and that he was the first divorced president to take office. Reagan he'd really had quite the go-around, politically speaking. He went from being a New Deal Democrat, so large programs in the era of FDR, to the head of the Screen Actors Guild. So he was an actor in movies. He was then a spokesman for GE, and then the governor of California in 1966, and then eventually, as we know, he was president. And he was seen as a really excellent public speaker, and was able to convince people who were suspicious that his brand of conservatism was actually progressive in nature. And in 1981, the top tax rate was moved down from 70% to 50%, and later moved down to 28% under the Tax Reform Act. And this is a shift in thinking that had been in place for decades, that those on top should pay a higher percent of their income than those on the bottom. So this is a shift away from that. And many of the percentages paid by those at the top are now lower than those at the bottom. And he's also credited for making famous this supply side economic strategy, this trickle down effect, in which tax rates for those at the top were cut to encourage investment. It does not typically work like that. If you cut tax rates for those at the top, they're not directly then invested back into the economy. Oftentimes it's invested so that it's then turned into more and more money. The federal government and labor unions were once again at odds with one another. So famously, there's PATCO, the Air Traffic Controllers Union, which went on strike in 1981 with 13,000 members walking off the job in protest. Reagan fired all of them and used the military to do their jobs until new controllers could be trained. This inspired a lot of other businesses to do the same, and there were no longer strikebreakers employed, but new permanent employees instead. And this meant that large companies didn't have to work it out with their workers. They could essentially dictate what they were going to do. And by the 1990s, the steel industry only had 170,000 people in it, down from about 600,000 in 1973. So the steel industry was on a steep decline as well. And this goes into the deindustrialization of the nation in general. There was a really sharp rise, unsurprisingly, in inequality, financial inequality, mainly due to tax policies, deindustrialization, and stock prices rising. Only the wealthy typically have stocks that would grow significantly. So if stock prices rise, this means that those who had means to invest in the stock market are seeing the benefits of that. And by the 1990s, the richest 1% owned 40% of the wealth in the country. This is 2 times the amount 20 years prior in the 1970s. The money that was concentrated at the top mostly went to luxury goods, real estate, and corporate buyouts, so it didn't really make its way back into the economy as had been advertised before. The middle class remained stagnant as wages did not go up, and the poorest 1/5 of the nation actually went into decline. And deindustrialization had hit African American families hardest, and many had just been allowed into those roles in those factories, and hence they were some of the last employees. And what that means is they were some of the first employees that were out when layoffs took place. In 1981, the unemployment rate was 8.9% overall, but it was 20% for African Americans. So the overall unemployment rates are not typically indicative of how any group of people other than the nation itself are doing. So this is oftentimes referred to as a second Gilded Age. We talked about the Gilded Age before, with having this sort of external glitter, this being covered in gold, but essentially being not quite right on the inside. So one of the major concerns about this second Gilded Age is the sense that greed had run amok on Wall Street. Yuppies were young urban professionals, and they had a high income, and they were also spending a lot of money on luxury goods. So there was a lot of money going out for young professionals. And there were federal bailouts of companies, and there were unregulated banks that were giving mortgages that eventually went south. And the national debt under Reagan's administration still tripled to $2.7 trillion. So even with the supposed interest in tamping down the nation's spending, that under just the Reagan administration, the national debt tripled. In 1984, the nation re-elected Ronald Reagan for a second term. Some were disappointed because Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid were left untouched. Some of these folks on the extreme right were hoping that these social programs would be cut, as they felt that they were supporting people without merit. And it had become clear, however, over the decades that it would be extremely unpopular to touch any of these programs. The Christian rights agenda had not moved forward significantly, in that abortion still remained legal, women were going to work, and there was even a woman who was appointed to the Supreme Court of the United States, Sandra Day O'Connor. And the conservatives, and the extreme right in this case, did have at least one victory in 1986 with Bowers v. Hardwick, and this case ended up upholding state laws banning homosexual acts. This was reversed only in 2003, so it's not long ago that this was reversed. But there were many states that had rules against same-sex sexual behavior. Reagan had denounced the Soviet Union as evil and built up the military as a show of force against it. And in 1983, he proposed a strategic defense initiative, which was a space-based system to intercept missiles that would have actually violated the 1972 treaty. And he believed that the United States should oppose totalitarian communist governments, but should also support authoritarian non-communist states, meaning they didn't have to be good, they just had to be non-communist. Gorbachev and Reagan had a good relationship, and starting in 1985, managed to establish less hostility between the two nations, between the United States and the Soviet Union. In 1984, Congress banned the giving of military aid to those fighting against the government in Nicaragua, Contras. And in 1985, Reagan sold arms to Iran to fight Iraq in order to release American hostages in the Middle East, but managed to divert some of this funding secretly to the Contras, which it had been banned to support them financially, but diverting some of this funding to them for 2 years under the cover of selling arms to Iran in order to fight Iraq. And in 1987, a Middle East newspaper released documents and details that led to the conviction of 11 members of the Reagan administration for perjury and destroying documents in relationship to the Iran-Contra affair. Reagan, unsurprisingly, denied any involvement. And what ends up being the legacy of this turn towards conservatism is that there were many contradictions during this time, but there was this lasting feeling that conservative values were on the rise socially, and the label of liberal was starting to be seen as sort of an insult in popular culture. And it's easy to see the fear and distrust of the government in many different films and TV shows that came out during this era. Things like Rambo to E.T. to Poltergeist, they all have elements of this distrust of big government agencies. And the 1988 election was one of that was full of mistruths and even openly racist material, which we're going to go over in the next lecture. George H.W. Bush would lead the world out of the 1980s and into the 1990s and beyond the Reagan era. So next week we're going to move further into this and look at the consequences of this backlash time period.